So, predictive processing, I'm going to throw that term out because you mention it. You bring it up after your historical kind of underpinnings of pain, giving a brief overview of the model. You dig into each of the 5 E's specifically throughout the paper. You mention a concept called predictive processing in the first E, embodied, and you give an example of how that applies to clinical practice. This is an important concept for me because we get questions, and I am asking this question to myself, is what is our treatment actually doing? What is movement? I have a movement bias. I tend to treat athletes. We're basing a lot of our goals on performance, and the performance are movement based, and that could be not just athletic endeavors but also physical. Whatever your performance is specific to your physical goals. But we're treating pain with movement, and the narrative could be just as, strength. You're in pain because this muscle is weak. Okay, well then that assumes there's some threshold of strength that would allow you to get out of pain. But that's as reductionist as the issues that we've been discussing up to this point. But we also know that there is something to the process of exposing somebody to a stressor, like, say, strength training, that changes something, where their experience of pain is now different.
Yep.
But we don't have a mechanistic explanation of that, or at least not one that's easy. However, what you guys explain in the paper, or alluding to this predictive processing model and the concept of graded exposure, I think does provide one of these possible explanations as to why our movement-based interventions have an effect on the pain experience, especially in chronic cases. So, all that to say, can you go into that a little bit, the interplay of predictive processing, what that is from a first-person perspective, and then how a movement-based intervention could have an effect on that?
Sure. So I don't think I need to go through our sort of standard understanding of sensory processing and reception and interpretation, but pressure, transduction, nerve activation, processing, and determination of what it is really hardwired in all of our learning, right? We've all learned how to do that. Or to understand sensory processing that way. And the predictive processing, just like what we were just talking about about enactivism, is built on a bunch of other people's understanding. So this is a product of experimental science and animal and human science, modeling, machine learning, and learning is actually the key word in a lot of my translation of predictive processing into meaningful questions like what you're just asking. I fell in love with Hubert Dreyfus, and then quickly after Andy Clark. If you can get through his work, it's also pretty challenging. But I did read the predicting surfing. What is it called? Surfing
uncertainty.
Uncertainty. Yeah, that's right.
Oh, that'll blow your brain up.
It did, and I don't recommend it for anyone except for insomniacs, right? But it is a fantastic read, and what he's done is brought together an awful lot of other people's work. That's the point I want to make on that, and in my view, it's kind of turned my whole understanding of sensory processing on its head, right? So we learn about our environment through that so-called bottom-up processing, what I just sort of ran through quickly. And we learn about what it is to be hot and cold and moving and so on. And then at some point in our development, and I'm sure that somebody has opinions about when that happens, I'm sure it's a biological process, so it's a continuum. It happens slowly. We start saying, oh, I know what this environment is. I can now predict what's going to happen next. So predictive processing is an explanation of how we've gone from learning about our environment to having more mastery over it, right? To having an understanding of our own body, how it interacts with the world, right? So it's that philosophic perception of first person. How do I know that what I'm seeing is blue? How do I know that I'm actually sitting in a chair, right? So all of these things we learn, and then we start saying, I know this, and so I don't have to pay attention to all of this bottom-up stuff that's coming in anymore. Right? So the other person besides Andy Clark that I just wanted to mention is Lewis Gifford, the UK physiotherapist, who was talking about a lot of this stuff, didn't use the same language in his mature organism model. And he always said, top down before bottom up, right? Because that's the mature model. So as we become capable working in the world and with other people, we predict much more than we process. We say, I know what's going to happen in the moment with all of my sensory stuff, interoceptive as well as exteroceptive. So inside our body, whatever symptoms we get from there too. And what we pay attention to then is when our predictions are wrong, right? Which wipes out millions and terabytes of data, right? And allows us to be very, very accurate and precise about our interaction with the world. So in a nutshell, that's what I understand about predictive processing. We make predictions, and we pay attention to the errors of our predictions. And when there's an error, that's when we have to say, I thought it was going to be sharp and it's a dull stimulus, so I can actually put pressure on my foot or whatever. And so to tie that into the question about clinical practice and in vivo exposure as an example, because it fits very nicely, we have patients who will predict, if you ask them, that if they bend over to pick something up, they're going to have a 8 out of 10 pain, right? So they and if you get them to vocalize that, they're actually aware of what it is that they think is going to happen. And then in an exposure model, then you get them to do the movement, and then you ask them what their pain score is, and it could be 8, but it might not be. And if it isn't, then we have a prediction error, right? And so what the application of in clinical practice is to set people up essentially to violate or to define or find find an error in their prediction, so that we can then help them to change the model that they have of the world into a more behaviorally successful one, right? Does that make sense?
Yes. Before I move on, I wanted to say, Katherine, that's the most succinct and digestible summary of predictive processing I've come across. So thank you for that.
You're welcome. So, I was going to add one more thought to it. Just give me 1 second. Oh, I know, because it was about movement. I was thinking about this today. One of the things that predictive processing or says is that we pay attention to information from movement. So as we move our own body, so this is just our body, not thinking about pressure or anything, we get, again, terabytes of information that potentially we could be paying attention to, right? But the model says we have to attenuate all of our attention to our internal information so that we can move fluidly and quickly in the world. Because if we paid attention to all the information that was coming in, we'd be distracted by it and not be able to interact the way we do, like the way we know we do. So we need this explanation because it really does explain how we can move around in the world. So if we decrease our attention to the information that's coming up, and then we put in the problem of pain, which we cannot ignore, right? We know that it is a signal that we cannot ignore. We are then fighting this all the time. We can't ignore it. We're supposed to ignore it so we can move. And then we start having these predictions of, I'm going to move, it's going to hurt. I'm going to move, it's going to hurt. And we get into a kind of a trap, right? So the exposure model is just it's a clear-cut example of how to do it, but I bet you $100 that each of you do it in a bunch of different ways. You constantly set people up to win. That's what I used to say in clinical practice. You put a lighter weight on, or you change the range of motion, or whatever it is, right? So that they can do it successfully, so that they have more self-efficacy, all the cognitive thoughts that happen with it, and then you move them into a more successful pattern, right? That's working with this predictive processing model.